Welcome to 20th Century Geek. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly. This episode, I catch up with friend of the show, Julian to discuss one of Alan Moore's less talked about works, Miracleman. But before we get into the review and discussion, it's important to know how this series came about, and just a little of its complex history. In the 1950s, a British publisher, L. Miller and Sons Limited, had a license to reprint Captain Marvel comics. You'll probably better know the character as Shazam at the moment. This was a huge financial success for them. This, however, came to a crashing halt in 1953 when the American publisher of Captain Marvel, Fawcett Comics, agreed to stop publishing the character after a court case determined that he was too similar to DC Comics' Superman. Not wanting to stop the flow of cash, Miller asked in-house artist Mike Anglo to create an approximation of the character for them to use. The result was the first proper British superhero, Miracleman. Using old Captain Marvel scripts and some other unused material, they continued to publish stories right up until 1963. The character then stayed dormant until 1982, when Deskeen started publishing Warrior magazine, a new sci-fi and horror comic anthology, and wanted to have a modern superhero strip in it. After discussing ideas with several potential writers, he received an outline from one of the other writers on the magazine, Alan Moore. Moore outlined a complete arc for the character and how his appearance in 1980s Britain would affect the people around him and the wider world. He also wanted to introduce a more realistic concept than that of the 1950s version. Des was impressed by the proposals and pushed forward with Alan's story as Miracleman. The story and strip started to receive good word-of-mouth response. However, it wasn't to last. Two key things happened. The first was that despite popularity, Warrior was not making enough to survive and came to an end in early 1985, with Miracleman's story incomplete. The rest of the story was to be completed under the banner of several other publishing houses. The second was that Marvel Comics took notice and demanded that the character have a name change. This was a disagreement that went back and forth and wasn't completely resolved until Marvel actually took control of the character in 2013. Now, we have covered some of the history, and I think it's time that I hand over to me and Julian to discuss the series in a lot more detail. Kimota. Julian, welcome back to the show. Appreciate you coming on the podcast again.
It's my honor, Scott. I love your podcast, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here, especially to talk about Miracleman.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting subject. So as you say, we're going to be talking about Miracleman, and specifically we're going to be talking about sort of, so it's Miracleman from the sort of the 80s onwards. We may cover some of the origins, but sort of the Alan Moore period onwards of a complex character and some of Alan Moore's earliest works. So we'll dig straight in really. So what's your sort of first exposure to Miracleman?
That is amazing for me to think about because I think it changed my life. It was Eclipse, and I was not really aware of Eclipse. I wasn't really following most of their titles, but somehow I stumbled onto Miracleman and onto the Alan Moore issues, which Eclipse had printed a lot of them, and so there were those issues sitting around comic shops. And I was aware of Alan Moore, and I thought, oh, I didn't know about this, I'll read this. And it just blew my mind. I loved the multiple stories in a single issue. I loved that they were doing, each chapter had a kind of like different feel. Moore did some of that same stuff of changing perspectives or narrative style in V for Vendetta. And it blew my mind, and I just tracked down everything. I tracked down the trade paperbacks and, the Neil Gaiman stuff, and just loved it. And it became sort of, I was already schooled in revisionism and kind of, Watchmen and Dark Knight, but the idea that there was basically another Watchmen sitting out there that nobody had read, and that for my money was kind of more interesting in some ways, just completely blew my mind. What was yours?
Well, actually, it's I many years ago, sort of early 2000, when I got back into comics. I was picking up I was picking up old issues of 2000 AD, and a local charity shop had a whole bunch in a stack, and in the stack, as well as 2000 AD, were 2 copies of Warrior. I think there were issues, some of the early ones, sort of 5 and 6, or something like that. I don't have them anymore because they weren't in very good condition. But part of that was Miracleman or Marvelman, and I sort of read it because it had sort of other bits in there. I think one of them had V for Vendetta in and this other stuff, and it was when I sort of went, oh my god, this is sort of original Alan Moore. And like you say, it was interesting because I'd never heard of it. I wasn't as well versed as I am now, and as you did, sort of, I went to find out more about it, and then I knew bits and pieces, but I never could find any. I didn't track down any paperbacks, and it wasn't until Marvel reprinted the entire run in the late 2010s, I think 2011, 2012, 2015 even. So it was 2015 that they came out. I read the whole thing, and as you say, I found that I was like, oh my god, like this is almost like a precursor to Watchmen, and I don't think anyone's really like, why is no one talking about this as much as I think they should be. So
yeah, one of the things that fascinates me about it is that, and I love Warrior. I have most of Warrior too. I think one of the things that is fascinating about Alan Moore's Miracleman is that basically, like, book 1 is a precursor to the Watchmen, right? And you can see sort of like early revisionism, a lot of the sort of taking superheroes very seriously, very realistically, and trying to elevate superhero narrative towards something that was literary and using narrative devices that comics just weren't using at the time. All of that stuff is there that kind of flowers into Watchmen. But what's fascinating to me is book 3, and I think that most Miracleman fans are either book 1 or book 3, right? Obviously book 2 is kind of lopsided, but book 3 is after Watchmen, and so book 3 is kind of like the last great revisionist superhero thing that Alan Moore did. So, before he, he does Spawn in the 90s, and he comes back and does, like, ABC in the around 99, but really, book 3 is kind of like, okay, I've done Watchmen, here's this kind of denouement to the entire 80s revisionist transformation of superheroes, where it's kind of going in this very literary way that is in some ways closer to Sandman in some of its concerns. It's kind of like much more ambitious literary project than and more long form than book 1. So I think there's a way in which, like, Moore's Miracleman is kind of both a precursor to Watchmen and a response to Watchmen at the same time.
No, I'm so glad you said it about what you said there about Sandman as well, is because that's very much how I sort of, how I read it. Really, is that it's I mean, like you say, book one is it's it's almost like a gritty reboot telling. It's sort of like it. I love the fact that it takes a rather sort of silly 50s comic, which, we know that 50s and 60s comics were very sort of their time, and it's very playful and sort of thing, and it takes that and puts it in a scenario where it even questions it. Like, it says in part of it that we had all these adventures, and it was almost like we were playing games. Like, neither side really wanted to do harm to the other, but we had to stop them, sort of thing. And then when you get the twist, and just for warnings, there probably will be lots of spoilers about Miracleman, but it's still worth reading even with the knowledge. When you learn the twist of how they this history existed, and it was all manufactured to be this sort of, and it was based on a comic, and it's actually shown to be the fact that the villain, Dr. Gargunza, has read Shazam or read Captain Marvel, is genius.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that this is almost like we've got all these. One of the things they talk about a lot in cinema these days and movies is gritty reboots. Oh, it's a real gritty reboot, and it's thrown out all the other stuff. It happened with like Bond and all this other stuff. And you think, oh, this is the first one. This is like a real taking a character that it's like taking the '66 Batman and moving straight to Nolan's Batman Begins. And I love that it takes it serious and puts it in that scenario where you can question it, and it's like, no, this is science. There was a real reason. It's science fiction, but it's still a valid reason. And I think that's so. I really enjoy book one for those reasons.
I do too, and I think that even more than Watchmen. I mean, Watchmen is a response to the Charlton superheroes, right? It's just a gritty Charlton superheroes reboot that is that had all of its names changed. But it doesn't incorporate all those old Charlton comics. And I think that, as a kind of, if we want to think of it as a sort of first salvo of revisionism that kind of flowers into Dark Knight and Watchmen, what a strong first salvo to say this whole earlier mode of superheroes, of the laughing at the end after the villain is defeated, and the just sort of silliness, the silly, unrealistic absurdity of it all. All of that is incorporated and subsumed within this new work in a way that is so much more ambitious than just saying, it would be like if you jumped from, Batman 66 to Chris Nolan's Batman, and in Chris Nolan's Batman, Batman's watching videos of Batman 66, or in a way where it's incorporated and therefore just demolished intellectually.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it, because it's so sort of like it's eye-opening in that respect, that it absorbs everything that's happened and acknowledges it, and sort of like says, well, we're not going to get rid of that, but this is what it is. And I just think those, for that, like you said, you're either a book one or a book three, and I do flip between the two actually. But I do get such joy from book one.
Yeah, me too.
Just because of that, because it takes those things in.
Yeah, me too. And I also like the short form of book one. It's the short form chapters. And about this thing about kind of incorporating this earlier version. I think that one of the things that superheroes, dark reboots and revisionism gets hated for or criticized for is this sort of, ignoring the fun of these earlier stories. Ignoring the fact that, Batman 66 spoke to a part of us. And I think that Miracleman, because of that narrative device, is able to speak to the appeal of this earlier stuff. So, you know, Mike Moran, you know, talks about how, yes, these stories are absurd and they're dumb. But having said that, they were also wonderful adventures, and I thought the world worked this way. And the way in which he is an orphan, you know, Gargunza experimented on these people who were powerless. And the idea that these silly adventures, you know, I think they spoke to a lot of us. Speaking for myself, they spoke to, you know, a wounded, sad kid. And you know, for a lot of these superhero stories, you could, no matter what your home life was, whether you know, had parents or had a sad home life or were just depressed or whatever, these were stories of bright adventure and wonder that spoke to a part of you. And I think that that sort of innocence, that sort of appeal is usually just ignored in these dark stories. And in Miracleman, it's incorporated in a way that I find much more satisfying.
Well, the thing I find most interesting about the sort of the book one is what, like you say, is that, you know, you said there about Mike Moran when he talks to his wife, and he's trying to explain, you know, when he first sort of he says Kimota for the first time in the book, and he goes home and he is Miracleman, and you know, he explains everything to her, this past, and he explains that sort of, you know, oh yeah, I was given this power of the universe of saying the magic word and all this other stuff by this being, this grand physicist or whatever, this extraterrestrial physicist. And she laughs at him. And she's like, well, this is absurd. And he says, it is, but this is my life. Like, you know, I appreciate how absurd it is, but this is what I remember. And like you say, so they do sort of incorporate it. But then I say that the thing I like is when they do find out that was a fiction, and actually all of that was you know, that was their entire time was actually spent, or at least the majority of the time was actually them spent in a comatose dream state. It makes it more tragic, because he's saying, like, oh, this is my life, this is what I remember, this is my existence, and to have that taken away, like, not only is he he's taken out of the world, but then he finds his life is actually a fabrication, is even like more tragic, really.
Yeah, I think so, and it reminds me of you know, so many stories that really have only become popular since 2000, like, you know, The Matrix, and now there's the complaint that, like, in Hollywood, a lot of pitches are sort of like, what if everything you knew was wrong, you know? Well, Miracleman was doing that in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do find it tragic, and I find it a touching allegory for growing up and kind of growing out of superheroes. Because in a lot of ways, like, you know, when Mike Moran is talking to his wife, I mean, that is a lot of superhero fans back in the day, before we had these movies and acceptance of the genre. You know, we had to negotiate those conversations and say, I kind of like Batman, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, and our friends, you know, kids who were older or girlfriends or whatever would say, you know, this is absurd and stupid. And we would say, yeah, but, you know, Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider, and that seems normal to us, right?
Yeah.
And then, you know, our girlfriend or whatever, you know, our older brother or whatever would say, yeah, you know, radioactivity doesn't work that way, right? And it was kind of like suddenly dawned on us, like, oh yeah, that's dumb, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's one of the things I like as well about the whole series, and we'll get onto the wider themes. But it seems to, like you say, Miracleman and Miracleman more than Mike Moran, sort of, he has an overreaching arc that obviously concludes with him living in Olympus. And I think it's funny that when you look through like, and I'll be interested in your take on this. It sort of struck me reading it again as you go through like books 1, 2, and 3. It almost goes through that sort of the certain archetypes. So in book 1, usually you get that the origin, and you get the sort of as a reboot, moving on from the original sort of the silliness into the seriousness. And then he gets a sidekick, or at least he sort of thinks he gets his sidekick back in Kid Miracleman, which they twist that, and then in the comics, obviously that's the thing, is you have a lone superhero followed by the sidekick, and then they introduce in book 2 the dog, Miracle Dog, which again is a twist on that stereotype, especially in the Superman books of like, okay, well you've had the sidekick, and now you've got the dog, the pet thing, so whether it be Ace or Crypto. And then in book 3, they introduce the female equivalent, so you get Miracle Woman. And again, they put a twist on that. So it's almost like the books follow that, as I would expect from almost like the 60s and 50s and 60s books of introducing people like, Superboy, Supergirl, Crypto, or Robin, Batwoman and Ace, or Aqualad and whatever, and Mira. It's that the trope of those characters are introduced, but then they're twisted. There's that Miracleman or Alan Moore twist on them, and I thought this was the first time I noticed it reading this time round.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly true, and I haven't thought of it as a kind of progression like that within those 3 books, but I've got to think about that more. But you're right that it has that same sort of like accumulation of the Miracleman family. And the thing is that Miracleman family was always part of the old Nick Anglo stories. That's part of Captain Marvel was. I mean, there was a comic, Marvel family. The Marvel Man had his Marvel Man family.
Yeah.
And so perverting that, twisting that, incorporating that in some way was sort of key to Moore's idea of updating Marvel Man and updating this what he saw in his original pitch as sort of the first British superhero, sort of reclaiming the superhero for Britain in a way, and being proud of being proud of his national story of the superhero, that it wasn't just America. So, but I mean, it's interesting that, like, over the course of those 3 books, you have the increasing rollout of more and more other superheroes, right? And there's also like Big Ben at the end of the first book, and in the 3rd book, he's reformed, and you have Wolfsmith, and there's a sort of like superhero family, but it's not like, it doesn't feel like that, right? It doesn't feel like Aquaman arc in which, like, you introduce Aqualad in the first movie, and in the second you get Aqua Dog or Aqua Dolphin or something.
Yeah, it's that sort of, it's sort of the twist, because I suppose, you could say that when in their old, in the old guys in that sort of the 50s and 60s comics, whether it be Robin or Aqualad or Supergirl or whatever, they served a purpose from a publishing point of view, but they were very clunky in a narrative perspective. I always remember reading, you had Superboy, and originally, it was Clark Kent as a boy sort of thing, and it really sort of messed up. If you were reading it as canon or continuity, it was a real mess. So they sort of jigged it and stuff. But with this, it's like you say, it rolls out through all of those elements, and introduces those characters in a similar way. And with those 3 books, I think is like a time. Is that the passing through those phases of the superhero arc of being alone, then the sidekick, and then the dog, and then the female version, and everything. But they're all key to the narrative. They're all part of this overreaching story that sort of results in the end state, really, at least of the golden age or of the Moore era.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I find so fascinating is the sort of brutal logic that's applied to each of these characters. It's so easy when we talk about sort of like dark reboots to think, it's Aquaman, but he's lost a hand and he's angry and he's a badass now, and it seems so cheap, right? But like the whole point behind Kid Miracleman being evil, not to spoil, but we've got to, is if you had a boy who had this power corrupts, and what do we know about this boy? I mean, he's glommed onto Marvel Man, but if you take I don't know how old he was, right? Like a 8-year-old kid, and you give him the powers of Superman.
Yeah.
He's never had to learn restraint, right? I mean, we learn restraint by being beaten up on the playground and figuring out what to do about it. We learn restraint by having a dog and learning to care for that dog. If somebody said, here are the powers of a god at 8, you learn restraint by having relationships and hurting people and getting hurt and learning not to do that again, right?
Yes.
Or how to be better. That 8-year-old boy never had to learn to be better. And so the way in which, like one of the things that revisionism, was very interested in was the ways in which superpowers would deform human psychology. So you see that in Watchmen with, like, Dr. Manhattan, right? I mean, he loses touch with his humanity. You see it in Rorschach with, the idea that basically a guy who goes out and beats up criminals like Batman is not, in a costume, is not going to be psychologically well.
Yes.
But he's also going to encounter things like a kidnapped girl being killed that are going to push him further over that edge. And with Kid Miracleman, it's this idea of power corrupting. And with Miracle Woman, I love that she's smarter than him.
Yes.
He has these like inherited notions. He has so much sexual repression. He is much closer to us, and she is kind of somebody who doesn't have all that baggage and says, yes, I have power. I don't have to be cruel about it. I don't have to be deformed in the way of Kid Miracleman, but I also don't have to be quite so beholden to these humans.
Yeah, I also think, like you say, the choices they make. I mean, like you say, it's the human version of I forget his name, something Bates. And then you've got Kid Miracleman is his super version, and he chooses to remain and age as that super version. And they say that Miracle Woman decides the other way. She chooses to choose her human side, and she becomes a doctor, and she chooses to try and better humanity as a human. And I suppose it is that thing of sort of element of maturity and choices. And she seems more humble as well in her sort of human form until obviously she's forced to turn back as well as the story progresses. And addressing that, I just say it's that thing of like I suppose it's maturity as a child. He's given these superpowers, but they both sit almost dormant, like they're waiting for something to activate them. Then there needs to be that trigger. And Bates, or Kid Miracleman, is looking to build an empire through business and through his own, manipulating people with his own intelligence and this other stuff. Well, she sort of sits and tries to keep quiet. And it's one of the things I was curious about in this reading of it is Moran hasn't been Miracleman for, I think it says 18 years at the start of the book. And he attends the opening of a nuclear power plant, and then when he's put under pressure, some terrorists sort of try to take hold of the event and sort of He's struck upside the head, and under all this pressure, he has a flash of a memory and says the word, his magic word, which is Kimota, which is obviously atomic backwards, and then that's it. That releases Miracleman. But it felt, this is the first time ever when I've read it that actually I felt, was that an accident? It's this whole thing of fate. Was this bound to happen? It sat dormant inside Mike Moran for all these years. Was this bound to happen, or could he have gone on for the rest of his life as Moran and not known any of this again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the terrorist thing is a little clunky. It's beautifully illustrated, but it's sort of like, I think at its best, it's intended to be exactly that kind of incident, right? That you're talking about. Like, it could have gone on, but something was going to happen, and it just so happens that this is the day, right? I mean, eventually he was going to be hit by a car, or maybe he could have gone on and died, but something was going to happen, most likely, to trigger this. What's interesting to me is, I mean, first of all, like, even though those old stories are kind of positioned as silly and sort of wish fulfillment, there's a kind of wish fulfillment in this too. And it's there in the Neil Gaiman stuff when Gaiman talks about the religions of this new world, and it's there in the Alan Moore stuff when during the fight with Kid Miracleman in number 15, the penultimate issue of Alan Moore's run, when the narrative just stops and it kind of incorporates the Wolfsmith story that had since been ruled out of continuity, although it didn't need to be, where, it's just sort of the narrative stops and says, here are the different versions of what happened here. And there's a kind of hint that in this sort of mythologizing that, I remember, there's a hint that, like, maybe Mike Moran, this is all in Mike Moran's head. And Mike Moran is dreaming us. And he had, like, a brain tumor or something. And this whole, like, turning into Miracleman at the end of that, chapter 1 is a sort of wish fulfillment. And similarly, like, the way in which Mike Moran is emasculated, his wife is more successful than him. Yeah. I mean, all of these sort of, like, superhero tropes of, like, I grew up reading superhero comics, and now I'm a middle-aged guy, and I've got a beer belly, and, in Mike Moran's case, he has a beautiful, woman who he's in a relationship with, who's smart and cares for him, but he feels emasculated. And Miracleman kind of gives him his power back, but of course it's a sort of, be careful what you wish for narrative in that respect, because things don't turn out so well for Mike Moran.
Yeah, well, they don't turn out so well for Mike Moran, but he makes a choice, though, doesn't he? That's the thing. And again, that's the other thing I think that's interesting is, you look at the tropes of super, anyone with heightened superpower. So this isn't your sort of Batman. I think this is Superman kind of level. Mike Moran, he chooses in many ways almost to commit suicide.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that actually, of the two options, there's a better choice to be made here. Where actually, I'm not contributing. To the breadth of humanity that the things that Miracleman could So really, I should step aside and let him do what he does. And so there's almost like a nobility in that as well. It's sort of, it's an acceptance of your position, like you say, and it's I suppose is it the darker side of that wish fulfillment? I wish I could be Superman. I wish I could, but then you think, well, actually, you've also got to accept that I'm not as good as that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I find that kind of a heartbreaking, intensely beautiful sequence. And and here, I have to kind of talk about, like Superman and sort of, I think that, I mean, these things are for me, to me, Miracleman is not just a story that makes certain narrative choices. It's a kind of manifesto about what the superhero is and what are good choices in a superhero story.
Yeah.
It is almost an article of faith for me that if you run the Superman story forward, he's not going to be Clark Kent forever.
Yeah.
He loves Lois, but, I mean, think about it. He has X-ray vision. Like the way in which we, like couples talk about how much they fart around each other. Or, it's that kind of like, does this kill the romance? What if you could see inside somebody?
Yeah.
You're looking at their internal organs. I mean, this, and not only that, but, you still love that person, but you can fly.
Yeah.
You can look at the Earth from outer space. I mean, you have a totally different perspective. And so, like in Watchmen, this notion leads to, Dr. Manhattan saying, like, basically, I'm done with humanity, right? I mean, I don't care. I mean, what does it matter to me if the world is annihilated by nuclear war? In Miracleman, I mean, first of all, I think you run that story forward, his alter ego is not going to survive.
Yeah.
It's a fiction. Superman's not going to be Clark Kent or even have an alter ego in 100 years when he's still alive.
Yes.
I mean, that's a part of the vestige of him as a boy thinking he was human. The relationship with Lois Lane is not going to work out. If nothing else, she dies. But certainly, they have entirely different worldviews. They're like different species, right? I mean, it doesn't, they're so different. And eventually Superman's going to take over the planet.
Yeah.
Or just leave and fly off into space like Dr. Manhattan, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where this one comes to, isn't it? It comes, let's say, it forwards to that notion of, if you wound forward, like, he stays as Miracleman or he stays as Superman, that super character, he's got super intelligence and super abilities. You jump to that point where, I suppose in Watchmen he takes the more cynical view of, Dr. Manhattan saying, I'm done with humanity, what do I care? I can see the past, present and future as a single stream of images and I can, manipulate matter in all these different ways. What does your single little Earth mean to me? But in this, you almost get this thing of, in Miracleman, he almost takes on like a responsibility, and in creating Olympus with these other gods, he sort of takes on the responsibility of providing, I don't know, sort of hope and a future for humanity. For me, it goes the other direction. It goes that other way of, like you say, giving to humanity rather than stepping away from it.
Well, and this is an idea that's later explored in The Authority, which I love so much. I mean, it's a central conundrum in the superhero story. If you're Superman, why don't you till the fields of Africa, right? Why don't you make, there are whole countries of starving people. You can do something about this. Why don't you depose Aung San Suu Kyi or, nobody can stop North Korea. Superman can. Why is Superman letting the rest of us worry whether we're going to die in nuclear fire? Why is Superman allowing there to be concentration camps? And if you were Superman and you do care about humanity, don't you have an obligation to stop that?
And I agree. It's a really interesting comic, because whenever that's sort of come up and they've tried to address it in the comics, it's always been that argument of, well, we can't get involved in we're not politically driven, so we can't get involved in the politics of the world. It's almost like the prime directive of, do you know what I mean? But they break it every episode or every issue. But it's a really fine balance, because you think, if these super beings, if you had the Justice League, ignoring Batman now, if you had these super powerful beings like Wonder Woman, Superman, Green Lantern, Aquaman, who runs the oceans and stuff, like, why haven't they just tidied up the world and gone, do you know what, here it is, we fixed it. This is what it is.
But not only that, but I mean, they have a moral obligation to do so.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that kind of prime directive, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is always used as an excuse to preserve the status quo. So, why, first of all, I mean, Superman, having been raised as Clark Kent, feels human, right? I mean, some of these superheroes are human. I mean, they're not from outer space. They have superpowers. The idea of not influencing human civilization, well, they do all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, why can you stop Lex Luthor, who's a human, but, if he tries to take over the government, you've got to stop it, but, you're not going to arrest Richard Nixon?
Well, it goes to... I recently did a review of The Dark Knight Returns, and one of my biggest issues with that book is the use of Superman. It's wound forward, as you say, and Superman is allowing himself, he's being used as a sort of a secret weapon, almost in a Dr. Manhattan kind of way, by the US government. And so this idea of him being the sort of the balanced, the big blue Boy Scout, is thrown out the window, because all he is a tool of the Americans' foreign policy.
Yeah.
But why Americans' foreign policy? Why is it? So it really rankles me, that depiction of Superman. But then it's sort of, so you do think, well, if you are better than this, if you are supposed to be better than us, and you can stand above it all, then why haven't you done these things? It's interesting that, this tries to address that, I suppose, in a way.
Right. I mean, I think that, what happens, I mean, in the case of book 3, it's not that Miracleman, decides, oh, okay, it's time to address, Syria or Russians in Afghanistan or whatever. It's, of course, the decimation of London, which I think is stunningly beautiful, and which is just moving to think about. And, that gets at another central problem of the superhero, which is, if you have, Magneto, right? If you have, guys like this, the world is going to change.
Yeah.
I mean, that's true in Watchmen, but, there's this kind of deformation of history. Run this story forward far enough, and, think of all the Marvel movies, right? I mean, we watch lots of kind of wide-scale devastation, but, you just kind of assume, well, they rebuilt it all, and there's no change to the status quo. The idea that imagine if in the first Avengers movie, you see the civilians die.
Yeah.
You see how devastating. I mean, you want to talk about, Tony Stark has PTSD in Iron Man 3? What about every person in the world watching what happens to a metropolitan city to New York City as it's being invaded. 9/11 is nothing compared to this. The world's religions are going to change. The world's governments are going to change.
Yeah.
Policy is going to change. The world is fundamentally different after this in a way that makes 9/11 look like a blip. And the idea is that, yeah, there are going to be casualties. This all-powerful Superman-like villain is going to destroy a major city, and a city that means something, especially in a British narrative.
Well, it's interesting. There are a couple of things to sort of to pull on that thread. Is well, firstly, if you think of Man of Steel, the Zack Snyder film, and it does it. The depictions of destruction at the end of that film, you say about the Avengers. And the Avengers is an incredibly sort of, like I say, but that's an invasion. That's it's an invading army. It's like a blitzkrieg. That is almost like the Blitz. The British Blitz on New York from an alien invader. And so I can sort of see that as a sort of, the Avengers aren't going to be blamed or aren't going to be seen in a specific way because they are the protecting force. And they haven't chosen the battleground. The battleground's almost been chosen for them. However, when you watch Man of Steel, and it ends up being, granted there's the two world changes, machines, whatever, but the majority of the destruction ends up being done by these two these super beings, these aliens that come down and just cause mass destruction. So the fight between Zod and Superman is epically destructive. And like you say, it became a massive debate of this thing of like, well, they fought through that city, and I don't care how many times they tried to say, oh, these people got evacuated and they did this, they did that. No. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were killed in that city. And so when you see the ramifications of it when you see things like Batman's response in Batman v Superman, and you see people sort of like decrying Superman, I'm almost like, yeah, no, you're right, because he is. The irresponsibility of that, I don't care how you describe it, like he could have done something differently. And so, I understand that then killing Zod is his only option, and I get that. But the destruction that's gone before it, like, you're right, that would change the world view of, oh, okay, well now actually we live in a world where there is a being that if they wake up in the wrong mood, they could destroy everything. That
right, but I think also, like, there's criticism of, like, well, Superman's not concerned. There aren't scenes of Superman grabbing people who are falling and saving them. But when you have Superman and Zod hitting each other, they're going to punch each other through buildings. Mm-hmm. And you see that, you've always seen that in Superman comics. Mm. But they're always flying through offices and conveniently nobody's hurt.
Yeah.
They're going to hit people. Superman is going to remember smashing through human beings. This is going to change him psychologically. There's that wonderful sequence in number 15 where there's a caption and Miracleman says, "I'd like to say that I checked the car for whether it had people in it, but I didn't."
Well, before we get onto the violence, onto the way it's depicted, because Alan Moore, this is one of the skills of Alan Moore. I think this is why it's so good, and why I think this book is so impactful. I say book 3 is so impactful because it's told in flashback. To be clear, so it's the narrative is Miracleman sort of relaying this as a sort of as a narrative, like he is remembering it. And we talked about there's a centre page. I'm just looking at it now actually, but there's 2 pages. There's the first page, double page spread of Mike Moran, giving up his life to become Miracleman. Like he's made that choice to become Miracleman full time. That's where you see that him releasing that power onto the world is a choice because he feels it's a benevolent choice, and it's like you say, it's a really sort of thought-provoking sequence. What you find on the next page, in something to remember, is that it's Kid Miracleman, so it's his former sidekick that destroys London. But Kid Miracleman was defeated to an extent in the book 1. and it was captured and trapped inside the psyche of the child Bates. I forget his name, Bates, but the kid, and he's in a mental institution. And so what you learn is that through, and this is horrific. But so you've had this sort of like benevolent choice to help the world by becoming Miracleman. Again, this is the thing of Alan Moore twisting things. This young lad is now in this institution, which is I don't know, it's sort of a mental facility, like a psychiatric facility or whatever. It almost looks like a Borstal kind of thing. But basically, he's about to be raped by a bunch of other boys in the locker rooms. And it's that thing of him saying, he sort of, they go, I'm not going to do the dialogue, but it goes through, it's three boys pinning him down while another one attempts to rape him. And he finally gives in. He's been holding back this evil, this character for months. He's been tortured internally, constantly, 24/7. And it's this thing that finally twists him, and he gives in and says his own magic word, Miracleman. And he unleashes the evil to rescue himself. And I think it's almost like perfect Alan Moore of that thing of you look at one page and you think, oh, that's really, that's tragic, but it's tragic, but it's in a good way. You understand it. To turn to this horrific moment of the evil being unleashed, it's so well done. It's such a gut punch that it's then they go on to the battle. Yeah, I just don't know what you thought about that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I haven't thought about that exact juxtaposition, but you're right, and one is sort of depicted as an act of compassion, but also of there's a sense in which both of them give up, right? Mike Moran gives up on his human self, who has lost fingers. I mean, he's lost his wife.
Yeah.
He knows that there is no place for him in a world with Miracleman.
Yes.
He doesn't make sense anymore. He can't measure up. And so there's a kind of surrender, there's a kind of, it is a suicide, but there's a kind of sense of just having run to the natural conclusion of the story. I'm exhausted. And then with Bates, I mean, that, inevitably, something, it's like you were saying about Mike Moran with the terrorists, that something's going to happen. Not all of these institutions are good places. And I think that, while maybe that sequence, you could say it's a little stereotypical, it's certainly hard to read, but there's a kind of surrender that he does too. And I feel as if both characters are kind of surrendering to a sense of narrative inevitability, that you run this story forward enough, Clark Kent doesn't make sense. You run the story forward enough, and of course, when all you have to do is say the magic word, at some point, Bates is going to say the magic word. Something's going to happen, and this evil is unleashed on the world, and the world is never the same. There's such power in, I say that word, and I unleash the superhero.
Yeah.
And, in that quote from Nietzsche, right? I give you, the Superman. He is this lightning. He is this madness. Using the Captain Marvel trope, the Marvel Man trope of just this one word unleashes the superhero on the world, and what's going to happen is the world will never be the same.
Yes.
The world is going to be traumatized. I think it's so powerful.
I agree, because I think that because the way it's then relayed in the next part is, I mean, Bates, as you say, Bates is released, or Kid Miracleman is released on the world, and he just goes, and the level of destruction that's depicted in this book is, there are pages that you say that are beautifully illustrated, but almost hard to look at. They're like some depiction of hell. They're absolutely horrific in some of the details.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's those armless people wandering through the wreckage,
Yeah.
and we haven't mentioned, John Pottleton, who, uh, just turned in brilliant work, especially by 15 and 16.
Yeah, it's and that's what I'm saying about this book. It's just people talk about Watchmen so often, and and not to downplay that at all, because it is an amazing book. But this is, I believe, on par with it. I mean, I've just found the panels you were talking about, and just to read this. So this is the narration from Marvelman. It says, "There were so many vehicles, all trying to get out of London. My apologists have claimed that the car I first hurled at Bates was empty, those who'd been inside having previously escaped. I'm sorry, but that isn't true." And so it's like you say, it's the brutality of this is actually he's actually saying, they admit this is a war, this is an out and out war between two godlike super beings, and we are just sort of, we are just in the way until this is done.
Yeah, I mean, we're rats on the battlefield, and humans are dropping shells from mortars on each other. What can those rats do? I mean, we are that irrelevant in a world of superheroes.
And and that's exactly it. So, so when it comes to the end, and there's a great again, Alan Moore with his mirroring and sort of roundabout. The book starts with an image of John Bates. It's Johnny Bates. It's actually Kid Miracleman sat in his initial destruction, legs crossed, cradling the severed head of a woman he's clearly killed, and the book ends with Miracleman sat in the wreckage sometime later, cradling a skull that's clearly decomposed since. And I just think I think issue 15 is just so well done, and it sort of rounds out to the the finale. Sort of the final book almost acts like an epilogue to tidy all things up.
Yeah, and I love that epilogue. But I mean, I'm amazed by how many just sort of grace notes and little touches are just perfect. For example, when Kid Miracleman is unleashed again and he's destroying London, Miracleman and Miracle Woman are playing.
Yes.
They are frolicking. They're gods. They don't have a care in the world, and they see the smoke rising from London from space.
Yes.
This sense of of course, we don't have a sort of Jimmy Olsen wristwatch that tells Superman, "You better get here before the damage starts." The idea that you would be frolicking carefree as gods, and this would have been beneath your notice. Of course, you wouldn't have noticed this. And the horror of how many people have already died that you see the smoke from space. It reminds me of 9/11, of, the smoke from the Twin Towers, which was seen from space. I mean, there's something about that kind of godlike position of looking down on the earth. And of course, these aren't omniscient sort of Christian gods who are omniscient and aware of everybody's inner thoughts and what they're doing. To me, that's so perfect the way that's done.
No, I like just the point that you make is they're not omniscient. These aren't God. They are closer, and obviously that's why they call it Olympus. These are closer to Greek or Roman pantheon of gods, aren't they? They have godlike powers, but they exist as physical beings that oversee, which is obviously the final result. But I also like sort of the final battle, like you say, that moment of how he wins the fight. You've had this mass battle, this total destruction, and they don't. I mean, technically they don't actually defeat Miracleman. They sort of, they eventually they force him, as you said, to say the word again, his magic word, Miracleman. And then you've got Miracleman. He's again faced with that choice, because you've got, he returns back to being Johnny Bates, the young child who's clearly been traumatized, and Miracleman is then left with the choice of, well, it's happened once. What can we do? So, and again, I feel this is the answer of, this is answering that question of, as we've said about Superman and the sort of the status quo and the morality of those superheroes, that they do not kill, regardless of what actually happens. And in this, we've already addressed the fact that Miracleman is willing to kill to try and stop Johnny, and the answer is a Miracleman, this godlike being, has to kill a child to save the world.
Yeah, I think he snaps his neck. And then cradles the dead Johnny Bates in the midst of the wreckage of what his decision. It feels to me as if in book one he's making a decision as Mike Moran. He's still closer to that fantasy world of those old 50s and 60s comics, right?
Yeah.
In which the superhero doesn't kill. And of course, it's the right decision to kill this child. He has to. I mean, all of this blood is on his head for having let Johnny live. And in the midst of all of this can never happen again. And he has to make a different decision. And at that point, he's not the man he was. I mean, he's not the guy who's still psychologically half in Gargunza's fantasies and half in that old superhero world of primary colors. Now he's the revisionist superhero. Now he's a mature adult superhero who, is going to be faced with this kind of decision.
And that's the thing, is the 16 issues, there were 3 books, it is all like one long story, and I find that it's a progression to that moment of we say that adult superhero, but it is almost like godhood, isn't it? It's that thing of taking responsibility and actually making that decision then to say, well, I'm going to use these powers not to just fly around and stop bank robbers or my own version of Lex Luthor. I'm actually going to use these powers to better humanity, to make the world a better place.
Right, and I think that it's fascinating that London had to die for him to do that. That's not his first choice. But in the wake of this, in the wake of everyone having seen this, right? I mean, it's also his public outing. The fact that superheroes exist in this world is known to the British government, but it's not, there's some footage and there's some conspiracy theories, but it's not publicly accepted. And then London dies.
Yeah.
And in the wake of that, it's like, I'm out now, and I kind of caused this by saving Bates' life, and I have a responsibility, and in the wake of all those dead, I can't go back to just pretending I can stop bank robberies,
It's that thing of, if you wanted to sort of raise this up to allegory for the real world, you can look at Miracleman as being. I know we're talking this through as a allegory for superheroes and sort of revisionists superheroes. But if you take it as an allegory for, like, almost, if you were to think of the superpowers of the world, whether it had been the British Empire in its day or America up until recently, it's that thing again of looking at sort of making those adult decisions and those compassionate decisions and looking and saying, actually, I caused this. So maybe, they do look and say, well, actually, yeah, we are the reason that Al Qaeda exists or ISIS exists, or the British, say, acknowledging, yeah, we are the reason that the IRA exists, and you know what? We are going to take responsibility for that and do the best thing to make sure that we then use the power we have to do good.
Right, exactly.
You can see it in that respect. That's what the decision should be made, to sort of, we should have this Olympus on Earth in some form. We've seriously got the ability to do it, but we don't, because we're human, and you almost need to elevate yourself above that to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I find thinking about the political aspect, and, I mean, first of all, I should say that, Miracleman does not get enough credit for being a political work. It's certainly there in book one. I mean, Alan Moore is still, he's not a young man anymore, but, he kind of started writing a little later. But he is very politically active. He's activated, like a lot of people of that age were, by Thatcher and by, the absolute horror of what was coming out of the British government in Downing Street at the time. And I think V for Vendetta kind of gets the credit for being, a political work. But I think, Miracleman, while not as on the surface, is just as political. I think that, the thing about superpowers, it reminds me of, when Barack Obama came into office. I mean, Barack Obama, a black man, who came to understand his identity as a black man, as someone who is within the American experience, but also has the wounds and is part of a legacy of fighting for civil rights and of America not living up to what it preached. And he went on a tour around the world, and he talked frankly about things that America had done that were not right, that were exactly what you are talking about taking accountability and taking responsibility. And, I can't imagine anyone saying that he did not love America. He obviously did and does, but his idea of patriotism was that kind of mature adult taking accountability. And in this country, the right said it was an apology tour. Yeah. And it seems to me that when we talk about, like, superpowers, and we see the superhero as a metaphor for superpowered government, that kind of, and I don't think it's just the two parties here, but I mean, that kind of sort of adult recognition of having in terms of Japanese, being the country that of segregation, of slavery, but also being the country of Nuremberg, being the country that created the concept of crimes against humanity, being the country that apologized for inserting the Japanese, being the country that should have done more about the Holocaust, but did play a part in liberating Europe. There are things that we can be proud of, but there are things that and this is true of Britain as well. There's a lot to be proud of, but there's a lot to apologize for and know that you did wrong.
Exactly.
And part of being an adult is recognizing both those things. And it seems to me that the critics of that in both of our mentality that's closer to the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
They're the good guys. They're the bad guys. And yeah, Superman tricks everybody, and he's kind of a dick, but it doesn't matter. He's the primary colored good guy, and I will not listen to, criticism of our policies or our history or our injustices.
No, and that's totally true. That's it. It's you're right. Those people that do lean towards that way, they have this rose tinted view of what that past was, of when they believe they were great, and like you say, things were simpler. Like in bold Technicolor, and heroes were heroes and bad guys were bad guys, and it's sort of I think that mentality carries through. But the fact is, like you say, Alan Moore, through Miracleman and like V for Vendetta and later Watchmen, was raising these issues in the early 80s. So, like nearly 40 years ago, he was actually trying to have these conversations and say, we really should be looking at the world in this way, or at least there's an opportunity to look at the world in this way. And it's just, I do think Miracleman, flies under the radar and should probably, I wish would be raised up in that respect.
Well, I think so too, but I also want to say, this thing about the way in which, not so much Miracleman, but, sort of revisionism and darker, more realistic superhero stories, get made fun of and get attacked. And sometimes they should be. Sometimes, look, I am not a fan of some of, these revisions where it's like, I have razor blades for blood and breathing is horrifying and it seems gratuitous. But, what you and I are just talking about is having an adult viewpoint on the world. And I think that there is a corollary. Look, I love Batman 66. I love some, silly, fun superhero stuff as much as the next guy. But I think there is a connection between that worldview in which everything ends for the best, the good guys always win, thus America deserves its position and hasn't done anything wrong. And there is a corollary between these two mentalities. There is a way in which the superhero story, and you and I have talked about it before, of just kind of, it doesn't matter how many horrible things Tony Stark does in those Marvel movies. He is never the villain. You're still supposed to rally behind him because, he's the star-spangled, primary-colored protagonist.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a dangerous thing. I think there's a connection between the way we tell those stories and how we look at the world. And I think, you're right to say Alan Moore is making those connections 40 years ago.
And let's not say he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of other political cartoonists and political activists that were were making those statements at the time. But Alan Moore was clearly had a medium through which to sort of present it, and was doing so. And I think that it does run through all in Miracleman. And let's not hide the fact that we've gone through this as a political allegory, and it does make all these statements in different levels of subtlety. However, this book does still contain a floating baby that can talk, and aliens that don't understand the concept of distance because they can travel anywhere in the universe at an instant. So it has its moments, like you say, those sort of Silver Age oddities and craziness still exist in the book, and I love them for it. That Miracleman does have a baby with his wife, and that baby sort of says "Mama" within the first second to being born, and then goes on. It's called Winter. The baby's called Winter, and it chose its own name. And so there's some just amazing imagination that goes on. But I do want to talk about the Warp Smiths as well. I don't think we sort of really talked. Explain really what they are, because it's quite an intricate idea, really.
Well, let's back up. And what we call Miracleman, which is, by the way, the name I prefer, started as Marvel Man, which was published in the 50s and 60s in Britain once, guy lost the license to Captain Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
And, so because he just continued these stories, he recast it as British characters. And so this was, according to Trump, the first British superhero. And so Alan Moore's idea for the magazine Warrior was to bring back the first British superhero, get the rights to this, and bring it back and do a modern kind of updating. And he had all of these ideas for how that would go. Along with that, Warrior was going to, and did have other features, right? So it had V for Vendetta, and one of those features was going to be Warpsmith. And Warpsmith was like, so like V for Vendetta is there's a silliness here. I mean, V for Vendetta is kind of like their take on Batman.
Yeah.
It's set in the future, it's dystopian, but it's kind of Batman. I mean, Miracleman is the sort of like Superman / Captain Marvel character. Warpsmith is Green Lantern. It's just that it's not, a human Hal Jordan who is drafted into the Space Cop Patrol. It is featuring an alien, and they are a really alien society, and they are, like the soldiers or the cops of these giant beings who are like, let's make these really alien versions of the Guardians of the Galaxy. And they are, and part of the twist of this concept is, the Warpsmiths basically can teleport, and they can, manipulate space and time, and their brains are hyper quick. And that's kind of their superpower, instead of having a Green Lantern ring. And they're fighting the Qs, or the Keys, which they're engaged in this long-running, sort of millennia-old war with another species that is a species that that basically uses another dimension to create additional bodies. So if the Warpsmiths are super fast and have these teleportation powers, the Keys have, like, you're in a fight, and you say, oh, I'm going to summon, like, the giant gunship body, right? And obviously that, ties back into Captain Marvel and into Miracleman, because basically the spaceship that crashed that allowed Gargunza to create Miracleman was a Keys spaceship, and he's using this alternate dimension in which you store bodies to allow Mike Moran and others to swap out for this superhero body. So the idea of Warpsmith was a version of the Green Lantern that had like teleportation powers instead of like ring-based willpower, and then it was tied into the Miracleman stuff through them having this war with a body-changing faction.
Was that intentional? Was that tie-in intentional from the beginning? Because they sort of, when Marvel released the issues, really from I think book 1, they have backup stories that are like the Warpsmiths doing their thing, sort of like you say, they are the strips that would have appeared in Warrior, and it feels like, if I was to take a modern equivalent, it would be, you have your main Batman story, and then you have a backup story, and it's that backup story that then pays off 6 issues later. You are being given sort of like forewarned information. It's that, isn't it? Really, that's how it's sort of set up. But was that the intention originally, or was it just a happy accident? Or
well, yes, it was the intention. The idea was that these Warpsmith stories would roll out more regularly than they ended up doing, and ultimately, it was only a 2-parter. Called Cold War, Cold Warrior, that was printed in Warpsmith. And later, Gary Leach and Alan Moore did a follow-up story that was printed in black and white in the in the Kimoda book that's a Miracleman companion that Tomorrow's published, they actually had a timeline of how V for Vendetta, Warpsmith, and Miracleman was all part of the same universe. And they wanted to interconnect these different features, kind of like, 2000. Warrior was like a adult version of 2000 AD, an adult kind of creator rights version of 2000 AD. And in the same way that those strips in 2000 AD kind of grew together and were interconnected, and some of it worked and some of it didn't, but in the same way, some of the strips from Warrior were going to connect. What's key here is, before Warpsmith shows up in Miracleman, just imagine you're reading Warrior, and I forget what issue, whether it's like 3 or 4, but Warrior is coming out, and it's coming out kind of bi-monthly, quarterly, whenever they can get it out, and you get to like issue, I forget what number it is, but it's like 4 or something, and they dubbed that like the Warrior Summer Special, and it was really like a standard issue, but it was kind of disguised that way, I assume, to get a little more sales. And in that issue, there's no Miracleman strip that continues the book 1 basic story. And you're just a few chapters in. Instead, there's the flashback, there's the flash forward to what ended up becoming Miracleman number 15, the fight, the penultimate Destruction of London fight. And it is a story, it's Steve Dillon, it's got 3 artists. Steve Dillon did some of the pages.
Yes.
And that has Warpsmith in it, fighting alongside Miracleman against Kid Miracleman, then Marvel Man, and in Silence, which is kind of like the Miracleman version of the Fortress of Solitude underwater. And so that was like, imagine reading this at the time. There's this character, Warpsmith, who hasn't even been introduced yet, who is clearly going to connect to the Marvel Man narrative. The Marvel Man narrative is like showing you its climax from years in the future, and just going like, we are ambitious here and we know where all of this is going, and it's all kind of going to connect. And then ultimately it didn't, and they wound up only doing a few Warpsmith stories. Sorry to blabber on, but I love that original idea.
It is, and it shows you, and that's sort of what I wanted to get to. I love the idea of the Warpsmiths. I think they're great. Just the concept of them as being, like you say, those cops, this alien police force that exists in this one area is so good. And then to tie it into all the key stuff, and then obviously that pays off later down the line as well. But the whole thing, I think it's fantastically well laid out, and it was ambitious to try and build up to that, especially in the British, comic, I suppose, at the time. So yeah, no, it is. I just think they're a great design. They're a great design, and they're a great idea. And as I think we've said before, and some, we've talked about things before, I like the fact that they are so alien. These aren't just blue humans, or these actually have like really alien concepts in their relationships, in their rituals, in their sort of understanding of the way the universe works. It's all, it is incredibly alien, and it's very well thought out. And I think it's a really and to build it in towards the climax is so good. And not just the Warpsmiths, but the keys as well, because obviously when they do create Olympus at the end, they represent sort of each of their gods, or the pantheon is created, and they use one of the keys. There's a key representative to Earth who sort of becomes a god of the underworld, so he looks after the bodies that they have in this other dimension, this infraspace. And I just think it's nice. It's a really neat, well thought out. And I wouldn't expect anything less from Alan Moore, really, but it's a very well thought out, neat package and sort of of ideas.
I agree, but I also feel like I feel like there's a Warsmith book, right? Like, I want more Warsmith. I love the Warsmith. I agree with everything you've said. I want more Warsmith,
yes.
And I feel like the same way, like, you know, Miracleman is kind of structured as 3 Alan Moore books, and then, you know, 3 Neil Gaiman books that have yet to be finished, with Apocrypha kind of tucked in there. You know, I feel like there's at least one solid, like, you know, the idea of Warrior was that, you know, these were going to be, you know, if not endlessly continuing features, certainly, you know, a few books, which then, you know, Deathskin was going to be able to repackage and sell, you know, abroad. And I feel like there's a Warrior book. And one of the things in writing about Miracleman for Sequart that you know, occurred to me is, you know, if you think of Cold Warrior as the first Warsmith story, right? Like, that is your introduction to the Warsmith. It's your first chapter of, like, you know, the Warsmith book. It's about the death of, there's a death in there. One of the Warsmiths dies. And that continuation in A1 is them mourning that loss. It seems to me that if you run that forward, the Warsmith who's present in Asia Chorn, who's present in the Miracleman story, dies in number 15, helping to save the Earth and stop Kid Miracleman. And it seems to me that there was a book there that begins with an unrelated death and ends with Asia Chorn's death. And that pack of Warsmiths sort of mourning him again at the end, but in the context of this experiment on Earth in which they're trying to coexist with the Keys, you know, in this special relationship on Earth. So I feel as if there's like an untold Warsmith epic.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how awesome would this be as, like, a movie series or something, right? Like, you know.
I know, I can see, I know exactly what you said. I can imagine it. Like, say, there would be two sort of, even if it's just sort of a, you know, like a 6 to 10 issue series that's sort of like, okay, well, here's your start, you know, that what happened with the Warpsmiths in that tie-in bit. Well, you wouldn't even have to have it appear in Miracleman. It would just be Miracleman and then this other book, and like you said, they would tie in. They would come in and touch points at that, you know, in the end of book 3, and then they could spear off again. No, I agree.
Exactly.
I think, you know, I'd love to see that. Actually, it'd be amazing.
Yeah, and I feel as if that story that is that flash forward story with Steve Dillon working on it could be incorporated into the Warsmith climax, and then you don't have to throw it away or rule it out of continuity or whatever, because it doesn't really fit in Miracleman 15. And you know how, you know, when you have 2 superhero titles and they're both dealing with Crisis on Infinite Earths or whatever crossover it is, there are always, like, a few incongruities between the two.
Yeah.
And the one in Miracleman is told, like you say, in flashback anyway. We don't know that it's 100% accurate. So we kind of have, like, an issue worth of the, like, 6-issue or whatever Warsmith epic. And it's just never been done. But I kind of feel like I want that to exist, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. It would. There's so much there to sort of, like, say, to unpick, and it shows how big the universe of this thing is. There's so much more you could do, and you keep getting glimpses of it. And I think, yeah, a Warpsmith book would be able to explore that in a whole different way, in so many different ways as well, like different angles of it. That would be amazing.
Yeah, I want Neil Gaiman to finish. We haven't talked about the Gaiman stuff. I know we're running out of time, but I love it. I think the Gaiman stuff is a masterpiece. I want him to finish that. I want a Warsmith book. I would love to see, whether it's in continuity or not, maybe some female creators, because Miracleman has, you know, Liz Moran is maybe not given her full shrift. There's some a little bit of rapey stuff in there. What if Marvel did a ongoing series that keep going forever, and the stuff isn't up to snuff. But just a few of these things done and keep that quality up. And I think that would be in the spirit of Warrior and what it was doing.
Oh, I agree. And there are so many fantastic creators today that really could contribute something brilliant to this. Like you say, but more than anything, like you say, we'll quickly touch on it. Maybe it'll be worth coming back to talk about Neil Gaiman stuff in the future. But like you say, this book, the Alan Moore era, sort of comes to a close, and it brings it to a point of Olympus. Like you now have these gods on Earth, and you do wonder where it can be taken. And Neil Gaiman, being Neil Gaiman, takes it in a very Gaiman-esque way. Really, it's not. There's no. I'm trying to think. I don't think there is any sort of there's no sort of fisticuffs. It's not big punch-ups. It's not that. It's incredibly diverse. I think it's 6 issues in the first book, and it explores different ideas of how the world has now changed with these gods, living among us, and it has some of the most beautiful issues.
Oh my God!
Both written and the artwork. And we will. It deserves just those 6 issues deserve a real deep dive. And I think we will have to come back and talk about this separately because they are. In fact, actually, one of the things I was going to mention is reading in book 3. I think it's the first part of book 3, maybe issue 11 or 12. There's a moment where obviously Miracleman is sort of walking around what we learn and become to learn is Olympus. And he talks about things. So he mentions that people come to request favours. Humans they go on a pilgrimage to come and request favours. And there's another one that talks about. It actually mentions that there are now fields of windmills that are used to generate power. Which now there are. But in that there's people that live in those windmills and sort of live and maintain them. Both of those parts form an issue for Neil Gaiman later on. He uses both, so he's obviously read through it and just picks out those little nuggets and turns them into an entire issue each. So each has 2 issues worth of material, I think, and they are wonderful. I mean, the one, I don't want to get into it because I want to talk about it again later, and I think it's another couple of hours talk. But just the one of the pilgrimage that those people take to finally meet.
Oh God!
And ask Miracleman and ask for the favour is. He doesn't really appear in it to the very end, but you get a journey through Olympus, and it's outstanding. It's so well written and so well constructed,
and beautifully illustrated. That's Mark Buckingham,
yes.
And he tries to do like a slightly different artistic style with each story, and that's where they. There's a man going to Olympus who's losing his daughter. And Miracleman can do anything, right? I mean, why can't Miracleman save my little girl? Is that beneath his concern?
Yeah.
How do you? These issues, these questions of like utopia. Are fascinating. What is Miracleman choosing to pay attention to? I mean, some of it seems capricious. I think of, you're right. I so often think about how everything in the Gaiman stuff is like there in the Alan Moore stuff, and it's just, a scene, a character coming back to things and fleshing them out. But, when Alan Moore turned it over to promised it to Neil Gaiman several years before he had completed it, Neil Gaiman basically hadn't written anything. I mean, he might have done Violent Cases, but that was about it. And Alan Moore was going to turn it over to him, and he said, there's just one thing. I've eliminated all conflict. I've killed, the lead villain. And I've created a perfect utopia and eliminated all conflict by the end of my run. So good luck with that.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that Gaiman could turn that story, and Gaiman doesn't bring, he kind of, it's clear that like some version of the villain was going to come back by the end of Gaiman's run. But the Golden Age, which is book 4, the stunning success of that, the stunning beauty of that, to me put such a lie to, like people saying, oh, well, we've got to, make Spider-Man or Superman not married anymore because it's just, we can't figure stories to tell of that. Neil Gaiman did the Golden Age, in which there's no conflict, right? It's all about the human condition. I thought it's beautiful and masterful, and I think of it so often. Why can't writers, and superhero stories make interesting stories that are challenging like that in these challenging circumstances?
And I think it's like you say, it's the fact that it's both what's it and a curse. It's like a pleasure and a curse. It's it's a good thing and bad. I mean, he's been given this sort of challenge of saying, as you say, Alan Moore sort of brought it to the conclusion by saying, yeah, I've resolved everything. It's actually all good. Now go do with it what you want, sort of thing. And he could have gone the way of many, artists and said, well, there was an alien invasion, or the key representative turns out to be a baddie, and all this other stuff. He could have gone. Do you know what? He could have gone that sort of way, and it could have been quite cheap and quite thing. I mean, but this is Neil Gaiman. It was never going to be that. But he does. He takes that challenge and he builds on something. And one of the things that sort of I think is amazing about that the fourth book in this is that it's clearly building to something else, because it's almost like building a foundation stone. That first book, or the fourth book, is him sort of taking those characters, those little nuggets, like they go on. There's a humans going on a pilgrimage to ask, to literally fall at the feet of God and ask for favors, or the story of the man who lives in the windmill, or the traveling through the world of the dead beneath Olympus, and that's where you find out there's another Gargunza, and all these other stories. They're all sort of like you say. They're drip feeding information, and whenever I do read it, my heart breaks for the fact that it's not complete. Because I'm like, right, well, that's that. There's little nuggets. You think that is something. That's got to build to something. There's something more to that.
Well, you know what? There were 2 issues published of the Silver Age, and I've read those issues, and they've also published the original art to what was going to be the 3rd issue, which was completed when Eclipse folded. And young Miracleman, who was part of the original 3, along with Kid Miracleman, comes back. And that's kind of the inciting incident of the Silver Age. And it's a very different story. It's not like Golden Age at all. It's a continuing story. And young Miracleman comes back, and he is horrified by what Miracleman has done, and he's horrified by the open sexuality of Miracle Woman, and he's a product of the Silver Age stories and can't adapt. And it's really quite fascinating.
I would I've never read those.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm assuming there are. I bet if I was tracking those down would probably be very, very difficult and very, very costly. So I'm not. I shall look maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can get a hold of them. Online somewhere. But they're technically out of print, and the theory is that they're going to be redrawn and the whole story is going to be finished, but Marvel has the rights to do with it, and it hasn't happened for years now, so we shall see.
Yeah, I'd love it to happen, and I think it would make money. I think people would buy it. It's Neil Gaiman, but I think really that you say that's obviously what happens. I say about it lays the foundation for that. one of the things is because one of the backup stories is these small robots going into infraspace and trying to rebuild him, isn't it?
Yes, right, and right. That's the retrieval, and then that's kind of like the prologue to the Silver Age.
Yeah.
And I think, just to wrap up, I mean, one of the things that I loved about discovering Miracleman was that it not only was it staggeringly good Alan Moore stuff, but the idea that you had a series where, Alan Moore had written staggeringly good stuff at the beginning of the 80s and the close of the 80s, before Watchmen and after Watchmen, and had produced kind of a masterpiece, whether it was book 1 or book 3, at sort of like both ends of it, and that you handed the series off to Neil Gaiman. I mean, can you imagine if there were a comic series that, like Alan Moore did amazing work for it, and then his successor on the title is Neil Gaiman? Well, you'd say, this is an embarrassment of riches. I mean, what title is this? How do I not know this?
Yeah. This is it. I think this is it. Everyone talks about these other books and of both, both these creators, of both sort of Gaiman and Moore and stuff. And then when you sort of speak to this, you sort of say, oh, actually, there is all this other stuff. Like, go and read this. And I think this is, as you say, an embarrassment of riches, of imagination, of artistic talent, and I think it's amazing. More people should be reading this book, and I wish it would get some keeping on going. Apparently, I've literally just googled it because I was curious when you said this more. So apparently, in July of last year, there was an announcement. So this is sort of July 2018, and it says, Neil Gaiman says, I'm thrilled that all the barriers that were keeping Mark and me from working on Miracleman have now been cleared. We're thrilled to finally be back in the world of Mike Moran and Dickie Dauntless and the marvels of the miracles. That's Neil Gaiman. And Mark Buckingham saying, I'm so incredibly excited to be back to work with Neil. Fingers on keyboards are going tippity-tap, pencils are sharpened and going scritchy-scratch. Miracleman is coming back 2019. So,
well, let's hope
live in hope. That's it. Fingers crossed, everything crossed. I mean, if that's the case, if that's the truth, this is a perfect time for this issue to be coming out, this podcast to be coming out, because I would love that to complete this story. Would be amazing.
I second that fully, and I mean, I think this is one of the real masterpieces of not just superhero comics, but of comics, period. And it's unfinished. And I would love, I've been waiting for 20 years.
Yeah. So let's hope for that. So I'll tell you what, we shall wrap up there. But thank you very much, Julian. That was amazing.
Well, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I hope everyone checks out your Patreon and subscribes to the podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts, so thank you so much, Scott.
Okay, guys, there we have it. A full, in-depth review of what I consider to be one of the best works by Alan Moore. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, but if you have any thoughts on Miracleman, please let me know. Get in contact. Email me at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com or find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, all under 20th Century Geek. I always love to hear from you and continue the discussion. Also, 20th Century Geek has a Patreon page. I would love to say that I'm a perfect being creating a test tube that has been able to build a multi-million-pound business empire. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So any and all donations are greatly appreciated and help keep this podcast going. If you don't want to give money to 20th Century Geek, that's fine. We now have an Amazon wish list for all the books that we could use for research in future episodes. If you're feeling generous, there are some great books on there, and we love second-hand books in 20th Century Towers. Thanks for listening, guys. See you next time. Kimota!